All right, so, all right, the grad students are here. Are others coming? Do you know? Yes. Great, okay. All right, so we're very fortunate today to have Professor Golub here with us. Thank you very much for coming. He's, just like other professors we've had, he is the expert in his area. So thank you for coming. He's the chair of the UCI Human Stem Cell Oversight Committee. He's director of the ICTS, just like other folks we've had in the area of clinical research ethics and consult service. He's also professor emeritus of microbiology and molecular genetics in the School of Medicine. Thank you very much. Thanks, Dr. Golub, for coming today. Yes.
There you go. And how do we do this, Doctor?
Well, good afternoon. I'll see what I can do about that. Everybody's going to pass it. No, you're in no danger with me. But what I'm going to try to do is take some of the things some of the topics you've already discussed, and try to give a little philosophic basis for how we think about the ethical issues in clinical research. And because I didn't feel like endorsing anything of Clint Eastwood this week, I used a truncated title. We're going to talk about some extremes, about the best we can do as scientists in thinking of models about how to go about this in the most appropriate way, and it's also just about the worst we can do. The history of this field has some really disheartening experiences. My plan is to talk for about 2/3 of the time about clinical research ethics, and then to turn for the last bit to just make a few comments about research misconduct. And I know those were the two areas in the text that we're covering here. I think it's most important in the field of ethics that people think about it and talk about it and get their mind around these things, and less important that I finish my lecture. So if there's an issue that comes up that you feel strongly about, that you want to expand on, that you want to discuss, stop me, we'll discuss it. I'll give you the PowerPoint at the end. You can look at the slides if you're interested. All right. I'm going to summarize all of contemporary bioethics in one slide. So if you're a philosophy major, this will be familiar. If you're not, you can do it in the Idiot's Guide here, Dummies, Bioethics for Dummies. There are two great streams of thought that underlie bioethics. One is called utilitarianism, and it's based in the writings of the great 18th century English philosophers Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill. And this is a very familiar kind of thought, which is that the greatest good for the greatest number is what's moral. This is a form of what's called consequentialism. That is, the outcome matters. You look at the outcome and you say, is this an outcome we wanted to get to? Is it one we're comfortable with? Is this the right outcome? If so, the process is probably okay. So it's the greatest good for the greatest number, and you want to cure disease, that makes people happy, that's good. It's the right thing to make people feel better about the world, to feel happier, to feel more comfortable. And in fact, they propose that you actually measure happiness as a way of determining morality. But there's a completely different view, based in the writings, the almost impenetrable writings, in my view, of Immanuel Kant, the great 19th century German philosopher. If you've read Kant, you're a better man than I am. It's really hard going, but there's some really interesting ideas in there. And in Kantian ethics, there's a much more rigid structure. Things are moral or they're not moral. And ethics is based in adherence to a set of moral rules and not on the outcome. It's not situational. And there's a quote from Kant, always recognize that human individuals are ends and not means to your ends. They're the thing that matters. Now, the world of bioethics, which is a discipline that really developed in the 1960s and has come into fruition over this last half century, has had these two great streams of thought. And it used to be that if you went to any meeting in which medical ethics was discussed, it was a Kantian versus a utilitarian arguing. But the two streams have really enriched the field, and now contemporary bioethics uses both. And it's very useful to use both, to ask the tough questions about it. Ethics is more about asking questions than getting answers. The whole field has been greatly influenced by a terribly ugly history. And we have to come to grips with the fact that medical research did not always adhere to high moral principles. It started out a good way, 2,500 years ago, with an oath to do no harm, to preserve confidentiality, to teach the skill, a high set of moral values that underlie the field of medicine. And it's often had this. But in recent years, there have been some tragic and terrible occurrences. One we'll spend a little more time on because it so influenced the field was the Nazi doctors' trial, the so-called medical experiments undertaken on prisoners by the physicians of the Third Reich. But it's not the only one. Here in this country, there were intentional exposures to radiation as we tried to understand the power of nuclear energy and nuclear weaponry. That is, troops were allowed to be within range of nuclear tests so as to test the biologic effect on them. They didn't get a choice on it. They were ordered to be there. Patients were exposed intentionally to infectious diseases as an attempt to determine how they would deal with it. And my field, when I was a lab scientist, was cancer immunology, and I was appalled when I first got into the field to read papers in which patients were subjected to injections of live cancer cells. Finally, several journals said, we're not going to publish these papers anymore. This is wrong. And I wondered what took them so long. It's not limited to the medical world. Biobehavioral world had some very, very controversial studies, the Milgram obedience studies, where this Yale psychologist was trying to understand how did people obey the orders of the guards at in the Nazi concentration camps? Why did they? And he devised experiments in which people were subjecting subjects to what they thought was severe pain. And they kept doing it because they were ordered to. Students like you and me. There were the experiments done at Stanford where people were told, we're going to do an experiment with the class. This half of the class are the prisoners, this half of the class are the guards. And they began to assume those roles, and the guards began to abuse the prisoners, even though they were both students from the same class. Some very disturbing results and some very disturbing experiments designed to make people behave inappropriately. The most central and important one is the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, and I'm going to discuss that in a little bit more detail in a moment. And it's pretty recent. We've had a great deal of discussion about what happened, what went wrong in a gene therapy trial in Pennsylvania where a young 18-year-old healthy man died. And it seemed an inappropriate and tragic loss. that should have been prevented. So this field was formed in the crucible of terrible, tragic events. And it doesn't get much uglier than this one, the Nazi studies. The Nazis performed experiments which were purported to be for determining how to best treat their soldiers exposed to high altitude flyers, freezing water, those who might crash in the North Atlantic, and battlefield wounds, by taking prisoners from their concentration camps and exposing them to high altitude, to freezing water for extended period, to induce burns, infections, amputations. And depending on which concentration camp these were done at, the mortality rates were between 1/4 and 1/2 of all those exposed. There were no provisions to avoid pain. And at the end of the war, at the Nuremberg Trials, 23 defendants were tried, 15 were found guilty, and 7 were hanged for murder. Yes?
Sorry, I'm reading that wrong. I think 50% is 22, right?
I'm sorry?
It says 23 defendants were tried, 15 found guilty, and sentenced to death.
Yes.
Is there another one that I'm not counting?
No, the 7 were among the 15.
Oh, okay.
The 7 among the 15 found guilty, 7 were sentenced to death, and 8 were sentenced to long prison terms. The remainder were acquitted. Now, the interesting thing about the Nuremberg, from the philosophic point of view, was that the Nuremberg judges were flying without a roadmap. There was, except for the Hippocratic Oath, there was nothing telling them what's the right behavior. And they did a very logical and very humane thing, I think, one of the great moments in jurisprudence. And before they did the trial, they called in experts, people who did medical research, and they said, what are the standards? What is it that people ought to do? What do we generally accept as the way to go about research on people? And they issued a code and then used that to determine how deviant was the behavior from that code. And the Nuremberg Code is the first and kind of seminal way we went about determining what's reasonable to do in medical research. And it started out with informed consent without coercion. And you've gone into informed consent and how we do it. This is the basis, came from the bench in Nuremberg, Germany, from the judicial bench. There ought to be some basis for it. You ought to have some preliminary data out of animal models that says it's worth doing in people. The results ought to justify the possible results you might get ought to justify the experiment. That is, if it's extreme pain, to make a minor improvement in something, it's just not justifiable. Only qualified scientists should conduct the research. This was the main problem with the German experiments and such. And people have wrestled with, do we use this data? Is it morally right to learn something from it that might help others? And the main problem was these weren't scientists. These were local general practitioner doctors drafted into the army and told, go do these experiments. They didn't know how to, they didn't organize it in any useful way, and the data is pretty much useless. Obviously, you want to avoid suffering, and people ought to be able to go into an experiment without an expectation of death or disfigurement. And people ought to be able to opt out, to say, I can't do this anymore. I don't want to do this anymore. And obviously that didn't happen in Nuremberg. Now the Nuremberg the Nuremberg Code is a tremendously influential document. But the main problem with it is that it was handed down by a group of lawyers, by a group of judges. And the medical community said, we need to do this ourselves. We need to adopt rules for medical research that underlie how we're going to go about it. And the World Medical Association, an international body, first took on the task of taking the Nuremberg Code, expanding it, defining it, coming to grips with it, and issued a document called the Declaration of Helsinki. And it provided a lot of specificity to what had been kind of generally outlined in the Nuremberg Code. How to do issues such as consent, how to deal with vulnerable populations, we'll deal with that in a moment, experimental design, publication, conflict of interest. And the Helsinki effort continues, and it's periodically updated, most recently in 2008. Various, they hold a conference in various cities around the world. The last one was in Seoul, Korea. And so it's a continuing dynamic process of updating our thinking on this. And sometimes it's been rather controversial, particularly on things like placebos. But it's an effort for the international community to set some clear guidelines. Here's some examples. The well-being, this is directly out of the Helsinki Basic Principles. The well-being of the human subject has precedence over the interests of science and society. Now, this is clearly coming for those who have a philosophical background. This is clearly coming from the Kantian or deontological point of view. No utilitarian would ever say that. They'd say, well, if it's the greater good for the greater number. But here's an idea that says, the person matters. Yes?
Does it explicitly define what well-being is? Because I feel like that could be a relative term.
Well, of course it's a relative term. Yeah. And I'm trying to remember how explicit it is in the text of the Helsinki. By the way, you can get the Helsinki text, Google it, but you can also find it on the UCI website. If you go to the IRB website, they've got the Nuremberg Code, the Helsinki Code, and the Belmont Principles, I'm going to talk about in a moment. So it is an important issue. What do we mean by well-being? Is it just you got a headache or you were really, your health and welfare was endangered? I think they mean it in the more serious sense of significant risk. Emphasize something very important, which is the science has to be independently peer-reviewed. And that's become integral to our system. You can't just do this on your own. Somebody else has to take a look and say, is this the right way to do it? Privacy and confidentiality, conflicts of interest. Which brings us to the most important wrenching change that happened in American biomedical research, the Tuskegee study. And please don't confuse the Tuskegee study with the wonderful story of the Tuskegee Airmen. Both happened in Tuskegee, Alabama, but they're entirely unrelated. I always get that. Somebody says, well, wasn't this made into a movie about some flyers? It was made into a movie, but not about flyers. It was a public health service project funded by the federal government, funded by you and me and all the taxpayers, right? And in this study, which started in the 1930s, 600 low-income African-American men were monitored for 40 years. 400 of them had syphilis, infections, and they were never treated. They were just monitored. The study was about the natural history of how this disease would progress. the participants were given free medical examinations, but they were never told what disease they had, and they were never treated. Let's take a look at these because they are real, live human beings who went through this. There's a group of the participants in the Tuskegee syphilis study. They were poor sharecropping farmers. All they got out of the study was a certificate there signed by the Surgeon General saying thanks. They were never paid, they were never told what was happening. It gets worse. As bad as that, it gets worse. The study continued. In the 30s, you could sort of, maybe, almost justify the study because there weren't very good treatments available for syphilis. But in the 40s, penicillin came available, and that cures this infection. But in order to continue the study, it was not given to these subjects. In fact, there were a number of situations where men in this cadre of subjects during World War II volunteered to be in the Army. And the investigators intervened with their draft boards to say, don't take them because they're part of our study. We don't want them to go into the Army where they'll get treated for this infection. Not surprisingly, because syphilis will kill you, many of the participants died. And this study continued being approved and approved through the Public Health Service until the 1970s when it became public knowledge because of an article in the Washington Post. And then there was an uproar. It was stopped and investigated. And recently we've learned that some of the same investigators actually went out of the United States and went to Guatemala, where local prisoners in jails were intentionally infected with syphilis. Although these subjects, thankfully, were treated with penicillin. So these investigators did things that we find appalling. The reaction was revulsion and demands that we clean up our act. Congress passed something called the National Research Act, and a large process was undertaken to consider how are we going about clinical research and what went wrong here. And a committee was appointed called the Belmont Committee. Belmont is, usually these committees are named after the chair of the committee. This one's named after a place they met, the Belmont House in Maryland. And a group of very thoughtful leaders got together and thought this through and asked questions about where are the boundaries between research and clinical care? How do we assess risk and benefit? How do we select people for research? And what do we mean by informed consent? And they set out a group of basic ethical principles, which is the heart and soul of contemporary American bioethics, medical research. And if you read nothing else in this field, you should look at the Belmont principles. They were smart enough to write a very well-written, thoughtful, short document that anybody can read in 20 minutes. You can get it from the website, you can get it, Google it, read it. They set out 3 basic principles. Respect for persons, respect for the people who are participating. They're autonomous, and we also have to deal with those who have diminished autonomy. We'll talk about what we mean by autonomy in a second. Beneficence. It ought to be doing good, right? We ought to be doing these things because they're good, not because they're bad. And They ought to be fair. So the three basic principles were autonomy, beneficence, and justice. Let's take a look at them. Autonomy has become the watchword of American medical ethics, bioethics. If you go to other countries, you may not hear it phrased this way. There are lots of places which don't put the centrality of the issue as the autonomy of the subject. But out of this experience, the Belmont, the Tuskegee experience, became the centerpiece of American thought on it. And what we're saying is that participants in this research must be capable of acting on their own personal goals. They have to be able to make the choice. Yes, this is something I want to do, or no, this is something I don't want to do. And the investigator has to consider those opinions. Can't say, well, this is good for you. Of course you've got to participate. It's the autonomy of the subject. The subject has to be able to say, I don't care if you think it's good for me. I'm not interested. The participation has to be freely given. And that means that you can't coerce somebody into doing it by saying, otherwise I won't treat you. You can't say, I'm sorry, we're a research institution. You're not here for research? Go away. The medical obligation still applies. You have to be able to treat these people, and their entry into a research project has to be entirely voluntary. Yes?
Are there any provisions for those with mental injuries?
Here we are. Very good question. There are people who aren't able to are not fully autonomous. Let's say you want to do a study in newborns. Let's say you want to do a study in Alzheimer's, late stage Alzheimer's patients who have really diminished cognitive capacity. These folks don't have the autonomy. Their autonomy is diminished because they're not ready to have autonomy. They've lost it. They're not capable of self-determination, and they have to be protected. And the way you protect them is surrogates. Somebody has to be able to act on their behalf with their interests at heart. So somebody, a surrogate can act for that child, surrogate can act for that parent who's diminished capacity. Secondly, we've got to isolate those who might be subject to coercion. So prisoners are subject to coercion. We can't say them as many as we used to in this country frequently. You'll get time off for good behavior if you'll let us inject this stuff into you. That's coercive. That became prohibited. And I can't say to you, you'll get an A if you come to my lab and let me take a brain biopsy. You can't coerce your students. Students and staff have to have that. They can participate, but they have to have that sufficient barrier to be able to choose. So surrogate consent, if we've got, let's say, 7-year-olds or 9-year-olds, they also have to what we call assent. They don't do the full informed consent, but they have to say, yeah, it's okay for you to give me a shot and I know I'm going to cry. They have to know what's going on. And we can't have excessive inducements. You can't say, I know a brain biopsy is not the best procedure, but here's $5,000, and I know you're in debt. You can't use excessive inducement to get people to go into research project. So that's the autonomy section, and that's crucial. And it's also a rather distinctive way that we've done it in this country based on our experience. Beneficence really is a restatement of the Hippocratic injunction. Don't do any harm. or non-maleficent, I can never pronounce it, maleficence. So be a good person. Do good for the subject. Maximize the possible benefits and minimize the problems. And all human subject research becomes a risk-benefit analysis. Acknowledging there's some unavoidable risk. You can't do research without some risk, but we need to identify them, minimize them. And we have to understand that the benefits may not accrue to the subjects of the research. We have something we call the therapeutic misconception, the notion that because you're entered in trial, you're entered in a clinical research subject, you may actually benefit from it. Actually, the most likely person to benefit is somebody down the line, not the subject themselves. They need to understand that. Some level of therapeutic misconception is probably essential to doing research, but we don't have to promise people, we shouldn't promise people cures that we can't deliver. And finally, this ought to be fair. We ought to be fair about it. We ought to have a fair distribution of the risks and benefits. And what was so appalling about Tuskegee was that we asked one small group of people, poor, hardworking, illiterate farmers, African-American farmers in Alabama, to take the risk for all of us. And to determine what is the outcome of this kind of infection, rather than distribute the risk across the entire population. And similarly, benefits ought to be distributed fairly. It shouldn't be just available to a subset of people. The instrument we use to deliver all this, you've already heard about. It's the Institutional Review Board. It's the IRB has the responsibility for upholding these principles. It's delegated to the institution. We do it here. We have several of them. One focused on the biobehavioral sciences and several on the medical sciences. And their job is to assess risk and benefit. So I'm going to go into the last bit on research misconduct now, but I want to pause here. These are the underlying principles about how we do medical research. It's been our legacy from a very painful history. But we've gotten to a place of high moral stature by doing it now with a real attention to these principles. Any questions about it? Any issues? Yeah.
What happens when those, I mean, I know we're going to talk about misconduct now, but what happens if you don't follow some of these things? I mean, are you just not able to conduct the study, or?
Yeah, the consequences of non-compliance. We actually have now set up here, I'm not sure exactly what sins I committed, I'm on this committee, a special IRB for non-compliance. People fail to comply at times. And sometimes the compliance is because there's a lot of rules, and sometimes you forget to cross this T and dot that I. And sometimes it's because you didn't think it through what are the consequences. And the institution has a broad range of authority to deal with this. We can say, all right, fix that up. You're going to have an educational experience for everybody in your operation to make sure that you don't do this. Sin no more, right? Or we can say, for the next 6 months, we're not going to review anything of yours until you get your act together. Or we can say, you're done. We're not going to review anything. You're not allowed to do clinical research anymore. They just had a case up at UC Davis with some unapproved treatment of brain tumors, which they just said, stop. This project is stopped. We're not doing any more of it. You can't do it. We're not allowing it. And the labs that were doing it are told to cease, desist, no more. So the institution has a broad range of options and how to deal with it. There's no shortage of weaponry to make sure that people comply. But still, people screw up. So let's talk a little bit about misconduct. And there's all kinds of research misconduct. I'm going to give you, concentrate on 2 examples. But I've worked on this issue a little bit. I'm not an expert on it. But let me just define from my personal view of what the basic principles are in research. One, there ought to be some integrity to the data. The data that's being presented ought to be an honest presentation of real data. That is, you can't just fake it. It ought to be yours. It ought to be original. It can't be somebody else's that you copied. And it ought to contain the information necessary for somebody else to replicate the study and build on it. Now, frequently people say science is self-correcting. Oh, sure, maybe they cut a corner here or there, but it'll self-correct because science always tells you whether, if people can't replicate it, they'll find out it was wrong. But that takes a lot of time. And these cases are a diversion from really productive lines of inquiry because you're off on some wild goose chase. So we've defined research misconduct as 3 things: fraud, fabrication, or plagiarism. And we've acknowledged that scientists can be very inventive folks, and somebody might dream up something we hadn't thought of that we'd all react to as, that's wrong. So these aren't the exclusive ones, but these are the ones we really deal with most of the time. Fraud, somebody presents something that's not theirs, that they didn't like the way the gel looked and they changed it. They didn't think that outlier number should be included and they changed it. Fabrication, they just made up the data. So-called dry labbing it. Never got in there, never got their hands dirty. Just made it up. There was a guy at San Diego, UC San Diego, who published, a guy in cardiology, who published at the rate of 1 paper a week for 2 years. Published 100 papers in 2 years in peer-reviewed journals. He couldn't do the experiments fast enough, so he just made up the numbers. Just made them up. He got caught, but it took a couple of years before people realized this is screwy. Nobody can do this. Or the very common one of plagiarism. You want a fast route to a publication? Take somebody who's already published it. Find it in some journal that nobody else has read and plunk it down and submit it. Happens with more frequency than you'd think. So those are the usual misconducts. That's what we're talking about. Research misconduct is not misinterpreting honest data. We're not perfect. You might see this and say, well, that really means that this is the cause of this, or this is related to the pH or the protein that we're studying or the enzyme that we're studying. And we didn't have all the data, we didn't have all the information, and we misinterpreted it. People misinterpret it all the time. That's not misconduct. It's not misconduct to say this enzyme doesn't have this action because we had the pH of the buffer wrong. That's not misconduct. Those are honest errors that people make. Fraud, fabrication, plagiarism. Let me give you two examples, and that's where I'm at. Two scandals, fairly recent, well, one more recent than the others, that were the highest visibility ones. The painted mouse scandal. To this day, people talk about painting the mouse as a synonym for research misconduct. This happened at the Sloan Kettering Institute in New York City. 6 years later, I did a postdoctoral, a sabbatical leave there, and actually met some of the participants, so I know about this case. A clinical researcher, a dermatologist by the name of William Summerlin, was a trainee of the director of the institute, a very eminent scientist by the name of Dr. Robert Good. Bill Summerlin had this idea that if you took tissue, he used skin, and cultured it in a special media he devised, that they would lose the antigens involved in transplantation, and they could be transplanted across genetic barriers. And people were very excited about his published results because it suggested ways of treating burns, other skin transplant needs. However, within his research group, his colleagues could not replicate his data. And he was under enormous pressure to figure out what the difference was. He made a lab presentation to Bob Good and his colleagues, in which he showed that there was, he thought, a successful transplant. His model was in mice, and he had a black mouse. He transplanted its skin onto a white mouse, where you could see very clearly when the graft was rejected. Well, he didn't think it looked quite good enough, so he improved the appearance of this graft with a magic marker. Why we call it painting the mouse. A lab tech took the mouse after the presentation. Actually, Bob Good, you should realize, Bob Good, the director of the lab, said, I don't care about this mouse. I want to see all the data replicated. Why is it that my colleagues, nobody else can replicate it? I want to see the whole project retested. The mouse is sent back to the animal room. A technician, who was the fellow I got to know pretty well, said, that looks funny, took an alcohol swab, and off came all this ink. And he did the right thing. He reported it to the director of the laboratories, who reported it through channels, and there was an investigation, and they identified numerous problems with the experiment and with the supervision of this fellow. The whole thing was blown up. There was stories in the newspapers and so on. Well, you think this kind of thing happens once a generation. It happened quite recently. In 2005, a similar kind of thing. South Korean stem cell scientist, Professor Wang, who was the most prominent stem cell scientist in Korea, perhaps in Asia. Korean Airlines had given him a first-class seat for life. He could go anywhere he wanted to. He had his own institute. He had millions of dollars to spend. He published claims of 11 cell lines by something called somatic cell nuclear transfer. Somatic cell nuclear transfer is a cloning technology. It had never been used in humans. And he claimed to have developed 11 such cell lines. He published this in the most prominent journals. I mean the most prominent, Nature and Science. International claim. He spoke on this campus and filled that physical sciences auditorium, the standing room. The data was flawed. It was fraudulent. Now, he had done the transfer into 500 oocytes. He couldn't make it work. And so he started fudging the gels. He started fudging the DNA fingerprint data. People began not wanting to give more oocytes. You know, you have to get these from young women. So he coerced lab members to give. Young women in the lab. You want to continue in my employ? You get the hormones, you give me the oocytes. The investigation ended up with him losing that institute, retractions. So here's two very high publicity events. And why have I taken these two? Because there's some common features here. These are the high visibility ones. These aren't the everyday fraud. These are the ones of the headlines, of the congressional hearings. These are the ones in areas where there was enormous pressure to succeed, and the pressure became intolerable, and people made bad choices. But these are not the ones where they set out, I believe, with the intention of being fraudulent. These are the ones where people passionately believed they were on the right track, and they just couldn't get the experiments quite right. And because of that, they manipulated the data to show what they passionately believed to be true. This is the danger of being seduced by your own results, by your own convictions. So they went off the rails because they wanted this to be true, not because they had decided. I think the case in San Diego, I think he was just a pathologic liar. These folks really believed what they were doing. And they were doing it with very poor oversight. In the case of Summerlin at Sloan Kettering, he was working in a lab that had about 50 or 60 people at the doctoral or pre-doctoral, graduate student or postdoctoral level. I know because I applied to that lab, and when he told me that there was 60 people in it, I withdrew my application and applied elsewhere. I wasn't going to go to a place that was that crowded. It turned out to be one of the luckier decisions I made. Bob Gould was a great scientist. What he was doing was very important. But there isn't a human being who can monitor 60 research operations by 60 students and fellows simultaneously and run one of the most important research institutions in America. There was no oversight of Planck. He was just on his own. He owned the institute. They had invested in him. He could do anything he wanted, and nobody was challenging him. The end result was some careers ruined. Someone left research. He's now a dermatologist practicing medicine in Louisiana. Huang was removed from all the things he did find a large amount of money, lost all his prestige, and I'm not sure whether he was given a jail sentence or not, or whether that was, but he was in great disfavor. And Korean science took a tremendous hit. Bob Good's career was severely damaged by this. And there are many, including me, who believe that Good, who should have won the Nobel Prize, because he's one of the co-discoverers of the T lymphocyte, never got the Nobel Prize because of this. He passed away a few years ago. He left the directorship of Sloan Kettering, took up a professorship at University of South Florida, continued to be a productive scientist, but never got the recognition he deserved for his scientific accomplishments. Those who collaborated with these folks had little damage. I think that's worth noting. Somehow it was confined to this small cluster of leaders of these projects. And the journals have undergone a lot of self-scrutiny. How did we let this stuff in? What did we do wrong that allowed these to be published? I think that's worth thinking about. All right, I'm going to quit there. And I'll take a few questions and then we can take a break. Any questions, thoughts, comments, concerns? Yes, please.
So for when people are doing misconduct, like weighing those guys, when is there ever like a penalty, like actual legal penalty, like jail time or a big fine? Because they're misusing like government money as well, right?
Yes.
Is that like to be a fine or?
Yeah, Wang faced criminal penalties. I'm not quite sure how they were turned out. And that's not American law, that's under Korean law, so I'm not sure how it applies. It is possible in the US to face criminal penalties, but it's very rare. In general, people feel that wreckage of your career is a pretty severe penalty. But it can happen. And misuse of funds is the major way that it would be approached legally. Because when you do fraud, you're defrauding the taxpayer. Usually this has been approached with what can the government reclaim from the institution where this happened rather than the individual investigator. But it can happen. And there have been instances. It's a small minority of the cases of fraud. Yes.
I was going to ask a question separate from your lecture today, but what are some things that in your role as part of the ICTS Ethics Consult Service do investigators come to you with?
I'm happy to discuss that. They come to me with a variety of things. In fact, I just prepared a kind of summary of it for a visit we're having tomorrow from our external advisory board. Some of the things that come to me. Frequently come to me for authorship questions, and I explain to them this is not an ethics issue. I'm happy to talk with you and sometimes to mediate these disputes, rather successfully on some occasions, but it's not an ethics issue. As long as people understand it's not unethical to be second author when you should be first. It's not unethical to be third author when you should be second. Really go away. But so there's some. The more interesting ones is how do you design this project to be fair, to meet the Belmont principles? How do we use placebos? One of the most common. Is it ethical to use a placebo in this? When should we have a placebo arm to this study? How do we implement this appropriately? What do we do with incidental clinical findings? This study is on disease A, and in the course of it, I think maybe we've made a diagnosis of disease B. What do we do with that? I've had questions about students. How should the students be allowed to participate in a trial? How do we protect their autonomy? So a variety of issues come up, all of which have been mentioned in this kind of overview. Let's take a break.
All right, so, Mr. Golub, so how about a 5-10 minute break, guys? Then we'll come back and go into our discussion. Thank you very much.